In the early hours of a spring morning in 1949, one of the most powerful men in the United States was found dead at a military hospital in the nation's capital. Only weeks before, he had been the very first Secretary of Defense, the man who held the keys to American military might at the dawn of the atomic age, the principal architect of the entire national security apparatus that the United States was building to wage the Cold War. He had sat in the most secret councils of the government. He had read its most classified files, helped to construct its machinery of espionage and nuclear deterrence, and carried in his head a knowledge of the nation's deepest secrets that few men alive could match. And now he was dead, and his death was officially ruled a suicide, the tragic end of a brilliant and exhausted man who had driven himself to the very edge of his sanity and then beyond it. That was the official story. But almost from the moment the news broke, the questions began, and in some quarters, they have never entirely gone away. Because this was not just any man, and these were not ordinary circumstances. In the final weeks of his life, this towering figure of the American establishment had come apart in a way that frightened everyone around him. He had become convinced that he was being watched, that he was being followed, that enemies were closing in on him from every direction, that there were agents and conspirators plotting his destruction. The most powerful defense official in the country, the man entrusted with the secrets of the atomic arsenal and the blueprints of the emerging surveillance state, had descended into a private nightmare of fear and suspicion, and then he had been quietly removed from his post, and then, a short time later, he was gone. And so the questions hung in the air, and they have hung there ever since. What had this man known? What had he seen? In the secret rooms where the Cold War was being planned, that might have driven him to the edge? Was his terror the symptom of a mind collapsing under impossible strain, or was there something real at the heart of it? And was his death truly what the official record said it was? This is the story of James Forrestal, and it is one of the strangest and most haunting in the entire history of American power. He was a man who rose from almost nothing to the very summit of the establishment. A poor boy from a small town in New York who clawed his way onto Wall Street, made a fortune, and then walked into the heart of the government and helped to build, almost from scratch, the permanent national security state that governs the United States to this day. The Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, the whole vast architecture of secret power and military might that defines modern America, all of it bears the fingerprints of James Forrestal. He was one of its principal creators. He was, in the truest sense, an architect of the world we live in now, and almost no one remembers his name. That is the first thing you must understand about him, the paradox that sits at the very center of his story. James Forrestal was never elected to anything. He never ran for office, never faced the voters, never submitted himself to the judgment of the people whose lives he would help to reshape. He was a financier, a creature of Wall Street and the boardroom, who was lifted into the highest reaches of government power by appointment, by connection, by the patronage of presidents who valued his brilliance and his ferocious capacity for work. And from that unelected perch, he accumulated and wielded a power that few elected officials could match, the power to design the institutions through which the United States would wage a 40-year struggle against the Soviet Union, the power to shape the machinery of war and intelligence and surveillance that would touch the lives of billions of people across the globe. He was the embodiment of a particular and recurring figure in the American story, the unelected man at the summit of power, building in the shadows the structures that would govern everyone else. And here is the tragedy, the dark and terrible irony that gives his story its weight. The man who built the national security state was, in the end, consumed by it. The machinery of fear and secrecy and total war that James Forrestal did so much to create seemed, at the last, to turn inward upon its own architect, to invade his mind and poison his peace, and drive him into a darkness from which he never emerged. He had spent his career thinking about threats, about enemies, about the hidden dangers lurking everywhere in a hostile world, and in the end, the threats and the enemies came to fill his every waking thought, real and imagined blurring together until he could no longer tell them apart. The watcher became the watched. The architect of surveillance came to believe he was under surveillance. And the man who had stared longest and hardest into the abyss of the Cold War was in some sense swallowed by it. To understand how a man comes to such an end, we have to go back to the beginning, to a hungry, driven, brilliant boy in a small town in the Hudson Valley. A boy who wanted, more than almost anything, to escape. He was born in 1892 in a small town in New York State into an Irish Catholic family of modest means. His father was a construction contractor and a local political figure, a man embedded in the small machinery of small-town democratic politics. And the family was respectable but far from wealthy, far from the world of privilege and power that the young James Forrestal would one day enter and master. From his earliest years, he was marked by a fierce ambition and a restless intelligence, a sense that he was meant for something larger than the narrow world into which he had been born. He was sharp, driven, intense, a young man who burned with the desire to rise, to achieve, to make himself into something more than the son of a small-town contractor. And he understood, with the clarity that would define his entire life, that the path upward ran through education, through connection, through the careful cultivation of the skills and the relationships that could carry a poor boy into the rooms where power lived. He worked as a young journalist for a time, writing for local newspapers, sharpening his mind and his ambition, and then he made his way to university, eventually to one of the great elite institutions of the American Northeast, the kind of place where the sons of the establishment were groomed for lives of leadership and influence. He was, by all accounts, brilliant there, a standout, a young man marked for success, voted by his peers as among the most likely to achieve great things, and yet, in a detail that hints at the complexity and the inner turmoil that would always lurk beneath his driven surface, he left without completing his degree, departing the university before graduation for reasons that have never been entirely clear, walking away from the credential that the place was supposed to confer. It was a curious choice for so ambitious a young man, and it suggests perhaps some restlessness, some impatience, some inability to simply follow the expected path that would surface again and again throughout his life. What he did next would set the course of his entire career, and it would carry him from the margins of American life to its very center. He went to Wall Street. He went into the world of high finance, the world of bonds and securities and investment banking, the engine room of American capitalism where great fortunes were made and the money that powered the nation flowed. He joined an investment firm and threw himself into the work with the ferocious energy that would define everything he ever did. Learning the business from the ground up, mastering the arcane arts of finance, selling bonds, building relationships, making himself indispensable. And he rose, with astonishing speed, through sheer talent and sheer relentless effort, climbing from a junior position toward the very top of his firm, transforming himself from a poor boy from the Hudson Valley into a Wall Street power, a man of wealth and influence and consequence. The firm he joined was one of the most prestigious investment banks in the country, and James Forrestal made himself into one of its stars. He had a gift for the work, a combination of analytical brilliance and personal drive and the ability to navigate the complex human relationships on which high finance depended. He worked punishing hours, drove himself without mercy, and demanded the same of those around him. And the rewards came, the money and the status and the power, until by the late 1930s he had reached the summit of his profession, ascending to the presidency of the firm, becoming one of the leading financiers in the United States, a man at the very peak of Wall Street, wealthy beyond anything he could have imagined as a boy, respected and feared in the boardrooms of American capitalism. He had escaped. He had risen. He had remade himself completely, transforming the hungry small-town boy into a titan of finance, and by any measure, he had arrived. It is worth pausing on the kind of man that world had made him, because the qualities Wall Street rewarded in James Forrestal were the same qualities that would later contribute to his undoing. High finance in those years was a brutal, demanding arena, a place that prized relentless drive, cold analytical brilliance, and an almost inhuman capacity for sustained effort, and Forrestal possessed all of these to an extraordinary degree. He was a man who worked himself to the bone and thought nothing of it, who measured his worth by his achievements and could never rest content with what he had already accomplished, who was always reaching for the next deal, the next rung, the next conquest. There was a hardness to him, a controlled intensity, a sense of a man perpetually driving forward against some inner pressure that never relented. Colleagues admired his ability but found him difficult to know, a private and guarded figure who revealed little of himself, who kept his own counsel and held the world at a certain distance. And beneath the polished surface of the successful financier, there were hints of a more troubled and complicated inner life. He had risen so far and so fast, had remade himself so completely, that there was something almost driven and compulsive about his ambition, as though he were always running from something, always trying to prove something that could never quite be proven. His personal life was not happy. His marriage was troubled, his relationships strained by the same intensity and emotional reserve that made him so formidable in business. He drove himself relentlessly and seemed unable to find peace or contentment in his success. It was the profile of a man of enormous capability and enormous inner tension, a man who could accomplish almost anything except, perhaps, the simple ability to rest, to be at ease, to quiet the relentless engine that drove him forward. And as he reached the summit of finance and turned toward the even greater challenges of public life, that relentless engine would drive him to extraordinary heights. And then, in the end, it would help to drive him over the edge. But there was something restless in James Forrestal, some hunger that mere wealth could not satisfy, some drive toward a larger purpose and a grander stage. The world of finance had made him rich and powerful, but it was, in the end, a world of money, of private gain, of the accumulation of wealth. And Forrestal seems to have wanted something more, something that touched on the great affairs of the nation and the world. And as the 1930s drew to a close, the great affairs of the world were growing very dark indeed. Across the Atlantic, the storm clouds of war were gathering. In Europe, the dictatorships were on the march, and in Asia, the empire of Japan was expanding through conquest, and it was becoming clear to anyone who looked that the United States might soon be drawn into a global conflict of unimaginable scale. And it was at this moment, with the world sliding toward catastrophe, that James Forrestal answered a call that would change his life and place him at the center of American power for the rest of his days. The call came from the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, who was gathering talent from across American life to help prepare the nation for the war that was coming. Roosevelt wanted men of ability, men who understood the worlds of industry and finance and organization, men who could help to mobilize the vast resources of the American economy for the titanic effort that lay ahead. And he reached out to James Forrestal, the brilliant Wall Street financier, and brought him to Washington to serve in the administration, plucking him from the world of private wealth and placing him in the machinery of government at the very moment when that machinery was about to be tested as never before. It was a fateful summons, and Forrestal answered it, leaving behind the world of finance to enter the world of power, beginning the journey that would carry him to the summit of the national security state and, eventually, to his tragic end. He was given a role in the Navy Department, and it was there that James Forrestal would find his true calling and demonstrate the extraordinary abilities that would carry him to the top. He became the Undersecretary of the Navy, a newly created position, and he was handed one of the most important and demanding tasks of the entire war effort, the job of overseeing the procurement and production that would build the mightiest navy the world had ever seen. As the United States entered the Second World War, it had to construct, almost overnight, a naval force of staggering size, thousands of ships, the aircraft carriers and battleships and destroyers and submarines that would carry the war across the vast expanses of the Pacific and the Atlantic, and it had to arm and supply and equip that force on a scale never before attempted in human history. And it fell to James Forrestal, the Wall Street financier with the genius for organization, to help make it happen. The scale of what had to be done is almost impossible to grasp from this distance. The United States entered the war with a navy that, while substantial, was nowhere near the size required to fight a two-ocean war against the combined fleets of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Within a few short years, that navy had to be expanded into the largest and most powerful fleet the world had ever seen, a force of thousands upon thousands of vessels, from the great aircraft carriers that would become the decisive weapon of the Pacific War, to the destroyers and submarines and landing craft and supply ships that made naval power possible. Each one of those vessels had to be designed, financed, built in shipyards that themselves often had to be constructed from scratch, armed with weapons that had to be manufactured by the millions, and supplied with the fuel and the food and the spare parts and the countless other necessities that keep a fleet at sea. It was an industrial undertaking without precedent in human history, the mobilization of an entire continent's productive capacity for the single purpose of building and arming a navy. And much of the burden of organizing that colossal effort fell on the shoulders of James Forrestal. He brought to the task all the skills he had honed on Wall Street, the mastery of finance and logistics and large-scale organization, the ability to coordinate the efforts of countless firms and agencies and individuals toward a common end. He understood how to harness the power of American industry, how to structure the contracts and the financing that would turn the nation's factories toward war production, how to drive the whole vast machine to ever greater output. He worked with the captains of industry and the admirals and the bureaucrats, cutting through the tangles of red tape, solving the endless problems that arose, pushing always for more ships, more weapons, more speed. The fleet that emerged from this effort, the mighty armada that would carry the war to Japan and win command of the seas, was in no small part his achievement, a monument to his genius for organization, and it placed him among the indispensable men of the American war effort. He was magnificent at it. This was the work for which his talents had been perfectly suited, the marshaling of vast resources, the coordination of industry and finance and logistics on an enormous scale, the application of business acumen to the titanic problem of arming a nation for total war. Forrestal threw himself into it with his characteristic ferocity, working impossible hours, mastering the intricate details of naval procurement, driving the great machine of American industrial production to ever greater heights. He helped to oversee the construction of the fleet that would win the war in the Pacific, the floating arsenal of American power that would carry the Marines from island to island across the ocean and bring the war to the very shores of Japan. It was a monumental achievement, and it established James Forrestal as one of the most capable administrators in the entire American government, a man who could take on the largest and most complex challenges and deliver results. And then in 1944, with the war still raging, the man above him died, and James Forrestal rose to become the Secretary of the Navy, the civilian head of the entire naval establishment, one of the most powerful figures in the wartime government of the United States. He now commanded the administration of the greatest navy in history, the force that was, even then, closing in on the Empire of Japan, fighting its way across the Pacific toward the final reckoning. And Forrestal was not content to manage the war from behind a desk in Washington. He wanted to see it, to witness it, to be present at the great events that were unfolding, and so he traveled to the front, to the very edge of the fighting, to observe with his own eyes the war that he was helping to wage. He was there in early 1945 for one of the most famous and terrible battles of the entire Pacific War, the assault on a small volcanic island whose name would become synonymous with the courage and the sacrifice of the American fighting man. He went ashore to witness the battle firsthand, to stand on the black sand of that contested island while the fighting still raged, and he was present at the moment that would become one of the most iconic images in all of American history, the raising of the flag atop the island's highest peak. Watching that flag go up, Forrestal is said to have understood that he was witnessing something that would echo through the centuries, a moment that would secure the legend of the naval service for generations to come. He had come a very long way from the small town in the Hudson Valley, the boy who wanted to escape now standing on a battlefield at the far edge of the world, the civilian head of the Navy that was winning the greatest war in human history. That moment on the volcanic island, watching the flag rise over the carnage of one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific, captured something essential about the man and about the height to which he had climbed. He was not a soldier, not a sailor, not a man who had come up through the military ranks. He was a financier, a civilian, a creature of the boardroom, and yet here he was at the very edge of the fighting, the civilian master of the Navy that was grinding its way toward the heart of the Japanese Empire. He had wanted to witness the war he was helping to wage, to stand on the ground where history was being made, and he had done it, placing himself amid the smoke and the danger of one of the war's most terrible battles. It spoke to the seriousness with which he took his responsibilities, the depth of his investment in the cause, and also perhaps to something restless and driven in him that could not be content to manage events from a safe distance. As the war drew toward its close, with Japan being battered into submission and the final victory approaching, James Forrestal stood at the summit of the naval establishment, a man of enormous accomplishment and enormous reputation. He had helped to build the fleet, had led the Navy through the climactic battles of the Pacific, had witnessed the war firsthand at the front. He was respected, powerful, established at the very center of the American government at the moment of its greatest triumph, and he might have rested there, might have been content with what he had achieved, might have returned to private life crowned with the laurels of victory. But James Forrestal was not a man who rested, and the world that was emerging from the war was not a world that would allow the United States to rest either. For even as the guns fell silent and the celebrations of victory rang out, a new and more frightening struggle was taking shape, and Forrestal would throw himself into it with all the ferocity and all the brilliance and all the relentless intensity that had carried him so far, and that would, in the end, consume him. But it was after the war, in the strange and dangerous new world that emerged from the wreckage of global conflict, that James Forrestal would do his most consequential and most lasting work. The work that would make him one of the true architects of the modern age. Because as the Second World War ended and the great victory was won, a new and even more frightening reality was taking shape. The reality of the Cold War, the long twilight struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. The wartime alliance between the two great powers was curdling into hostility and suspicion. The Soviet Union was tightening its grip on Eastern Europe, and across the world a new contest was beginning, a struggle between two superpowers armed, soon enough, with weapons capable of destroying civilization itself. And the United States, which had largely demobilized its vast military and intelligence apparatus after previous wars, now faced a permanent global confrontation that would require a permanent state of readiness, a permanent machinery of defense and intelligence unlike anything in the nation's history. James Forrestal understood this new reality earlier and more clearly than almost anyone else in the American government, and he became one of its most important and most influential prophets. He was among the first and the most fervent of the Cold War hawks, a man who grasped, with a clarity that bordered on obsession, the scale and the danger of the Soviet threat. He read deeply about communism and the Soviet system, studied the ideology and the ambitions of America's new adversary, and concluded that the United States faced a long, grim, existential struggle that would demand everything the nation could muster. He championed the men and the ideas that would define American Cold War strategy, the diplomats and thinkers who argued for a policy of containment, the steady, patient, relentless resistance to Soviet expansion across the globe. He pushed within the government for a harder line, for greater vigilance, for the construction of the institutions and the capabilities that the new struggle would require. He saw the future, and the future was a world of permanent confrontation, and he set out to prepare his country for it. There was, even then, something striking about the intensity of Forrestal's focus on the Soviet threat, a quality that set him apart even from his fellow hawks, and that hints, in retrospect, at the obsessive cast of mind that would later overwhelm him. He did not merely believe that the Soviet Union was a dangerous adversary, he studied it, brooded over it, immersed himself in the analysis of communist ideology and Soviet intentions with an intensity that bordered on the consuming. He read the dispatches and the reports, sought out the experts, pressed his colleagues to take the threat as seriously as he did. He was instrumental in elevating the thinking of the diplomats and strategists who argued that the Soviet Union was driven by an implacable ideological hostility that could not be appeased, only contained, and he championed their ideas within the highest councils of the government, helping to make their grim view of the world into official American policy. He saw threats and dangers where others saw only the ordinary friction of international affairs, and he saw them everywhere, the Soviet menace seeming to him to reach into every corner of the globe and every dimension of the struggle. This clarity, this early and unflinching recognition of the scale of the Cold War, was in many ways prophetic, and it made Forrestal one of the most important architects of America's response to the Soviet challenge. But there was also, perhaps, a shadow side to it, a tendency toward a kind of totalizing vigilance, a habit of seeing enemies and conspiracies and hidden dangers behind every development, that in a man under enormous strain might curdle into something darker. The very qualities that made him such an effective Cold Warrior, the relentless focus on threat, the conviction that powerful and hidden forces were working against the things he cherished, were qualities that, turned inward and amplified by exhaustion and illness, could become the raw material of paranoia. But all of that lay in the future. For now, his vigilance was an asset, and he poured it into the great work of building the institutions that would wage the long struggle ahead. And the centerpiece of that preparation, the great project that would consume his energies and define his legacy, was the wholesale reconstruction of the American national security apparatus, the building of the permanent institutions through which the United States would wage the Cold War. The system that had existed before and during the Second World War was, Forrestal and others believed, inadequate to the new age. The military services, the Army and the Navy, operated as separate and often rival fiefdoms, with no unified command, no single authority to coordinate the nation's defenses. The intelligence apparatus was fragmented and improvised. There was no permanent body to advise the president on the great questions of national security, no settled machinery for the making of strategy in an age of perpetual danger. And so, in the years immediately after the war, a great debate unfolded over how to reorganize the entire structure of American defense and intelligence for the Cold War, and James Forrestal was at the very center of it. The debate was fierce and complicated, and Forrestal's own role in it was complex, for he did not simply impose a vision, but helped to forge a compromise out of competing interests and bitter rivalries. The central question was the unification of the armed forces, the proposal to bring the separate military services together under a single overarching authority, a single Department of Defense headed by a single civilian secretary. It was a controversial idea, fiercely resisted by some and championed by others, and the Navy, which Forrestal led, was among the most wary, fearing that unification would diminish its independence and subordinate it to the other services. Forrestal himself had real reservations about the most sweeping versions of the plan, but he was, above all, a pragmatist and a builder, and he worked, through the long and difficult negotiations, to craft a structure that could win acceptance, a compromise that would create the new unified establishment while preserving what he believed needed to be preserved. And out of that long struggle came one of the most important pieces of legislation in modern American history. It was called the National Security Act, passed in 1947, and it created in a single stroke the architecture of the modern American national security state, the institutions that govern the nation's defense and intelligence to this very day. The act brought the military services together under a new unified establishment headed by a new cabinet officer, the Secretary of Defense, who would oversee the entire military apparatus of the United States. It created an independent Air Force, recognizing the decisive importance that air power had assumed in modern war. It established the National Security Council, the body that would advise the president on the great questions of strategy and bring together the senior figures of the government to deliberate on matters of war and peace. And, most fatefully of all, it created the Central Intelligence Agency, the permanent civilian intelligence service that would become the instrument of American covert action and espionage across the globe, the secret arm of American power that would topple governments and wage hidden wars for decades to come. It is difficult to overstate how profound a transformation this represented in the character of the American government and the American Republic. For most of its history, the United States had been deeply suspicious of standing armies, of permanent military establishments, of the very idea of a large and entrenched apparatus of state power operating in peacetime. The nation had fought its wars and then demobilized, returning to a condition of relative openness in which the machinery of war and secrecy was dismantled rather than maintained. But the Cold War changed all of that, and the National Security Act enshrined the change in law. It created a permanent military establishment of enormous size, a permanent intelligence service operating in the shadows, a permanent apparatus of national security that would never be dismantled, that would grow and grow through the decades until it became a colossus, a state within the state, a vast and largely hidden machinery of power that would touch every corner of American life and reach into every corner of the world. And much of it would operate beyond the easy reach of the public, beyond the scrutiny of the voters, beyond the ordinary mechanisms of democratic accountability. The intelligence agency, in particular, was designed to work in secret, to conduct operations that could be denied, to wage hidden wars and topple inconvenient governments, and gather the nation's secrets in the dark. The whole structure embodied a tension that has never been fully resolved, the tension between the demands of national security in a dangerous world and the principles of openness and accountability on which a free republic is supposed to rest. James Forrestal and the other architects of the national security state believed they were building the instruments necessary to protect the nation in an age of existential peril, and perhaps they were. But they were also building something that would accumulate enormous unaccountable power, something that would shape the destiny of nations from the shadows, something whose full consequences they could not foresee. They were creating the machinery of the secret state, and that machinery would outlive them all. Think about the magnitude of what was created in that single piece of legislation, the sheer scale of the machinery that came into being. The Department of Defense, the largest and most powerful military establishment in the history of the world, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Secret Service that would become synonymous with covert operations and clandestine power, the National Security Council, the inner sanctum where the most consequential decisions of the Cold War would be made. These were not minor bureaucratic adjustments. They were the foundational institutions of American superpower, the permanent structures through which the United States would project its might and wage its struggles for the next half-century and beyond. And James Forrestal was one of the principal architects of them all, a central figure in their creation, a man whose vision and labor helped to bring into being the very machinery of modern American power. He had built something that would outlast him by generations, something that shapes the world to this day, and he was about to be placed at its head. For when the new position of Secretary of Defense was created, the most powerful military office in the United States outside of the presidency itself, the man chosen to fill it, the first man ever to hold it, was James Forrestal. In the autumn of 1947, he became the first Secretary of Defense of the United States, the head of the entire unified military establishment, the civilian master of the Army, the Navy, and the new Air Force, the man responsible for the defense of the nation at the most dangerous moment in its history. It was the summit of his career, the culmination of his extraordinary rise, the poor boy from the Hudson Valley now standing at the very top of the American defense establishment, one of the most powerful men in the most powerful nation on earth. He had built the office, and now he occupied it. He had designed the machine, and now he sat at its controls. There was a profound and fateful irony in this, one that would only become clear as events unfolded. James Forrestal had helped to design the office of Secretary of Defense, and in designing it, he had, with the best of intentions, helped to create a position that was almost impossible to hold. In the long negotiations over unification, he had fought to preserve the autonomy of the military services, to prevent the new secretary from becoming an all-powerful overlord who could ride roughshod over the Navy and the other branches. He had succeeded in that aim, crafting a compromise in which the Secretary of Defense was given the responsibility for coordinating the vast military establishment, but not the full authority to command it, in which the services retained much of their independence and their power to resist direction from above. It was a structure designed to reassure the wary, to win acceptance for unification by limiting how far it would go. And then James Forrestal had been placed in the very office whose powers he had helped to constrain. He now bore the responsibility for managing the entire military apparatus of the United States, for imposing order and coherence on the rival services, for confronting the gravest threats the nation had ever faced, and he had to do it all with authority that was, by his own design, frustratingly incomplete. The services fought him. They battled one another and they battled him, struggling over budgets and roles and missions, each protecting its own turf, each resisting his efforts to bring them to heel. He was supposed to lead, but he had been given only limited means to compel, and so he was forced to govern by persuasion and exhortation and sheer force of will, wearing himself down in endless battles that never seemed to end. The office that should have been the crowning achievement of his career became instead a kind of trap, a position of immense pressure and inadequate power, a burden that would grind him down and help to break him. He had built the machine, and the machine he had built would help to destroy its builder. It should have been his triumph, the crowning achievement of a brilliant career, the reward for a lifetime of relentless ambition and tireless work. And in a sense it was, but it was also, as it would turn out, the beginning of the end. The start of a descent that would carry him from the heights of power to the depths of despair, and, finally, to death. Because the office that James Forrestal had helped to create, the office of Secretary of Defense, was, in those early years, an almost impossible job, a position of vast responsibility but limited authority, a role that placed upon the man who held it an enormous burden, while denying him the power he needed to bear it. Forrestal had designed a compromise, and the compromise had created a structure in which the Secretary of Defense was supposed to coordinate and direct the military services without truly commanding them, to impose order on rival institutions that fought him at every turn. And the strain of that impossible task, combined with the relentless pressures of the early Cold War and the demons that lurked within his own restless and intense personality, would begin, slowly at first and then with terrible speed, to break him. He took office at a moment of mounting crisis, with the Cold War growing colder and more dangerous by the month. The Soviet Union and the United States were squaring off across a divided Europe. The threat of a new and even more terrible war hung over the world, and James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, found himself at the center of it all, responsible for preparing the nation's defenses, for managing its military, for confronting the Soviet threat that he, more than almost anyone, believed to be existential and overwhelming. The pressures were enormous, and they fell upon a man who had never learned how to rest, who drove himself without mercy, who carried the weight of the world's most dangerous problems on his shoulders and could not put them down. He worked himself to exhaustion and beyond, consumed by the demands of the office and the magnitude of the dangers he believed the nation faced. And beneath the surface, in the depths of his intense and driven and increasingly troubled mind, something was beginning to give way. The pressures came from every direction at once, and they were relentless. There were the endless inter-service battles, the savage struggles between the Army and the Navy, and the new Air Force over budgets and roles, and the future of American defense. Struggles that placed Forrestal in the impossible position of trying to satisfy rivals whose interests could not all be satisfied, of absorbing the anger of every side while pleasing none. There was the crushing workload, the ceaseless flow of crises and decisions and demands, the weight of responsibility for the defense of the nation in its most dangerous hour, all of it falling on a man who had never learned to delegate, who insisted on mastering every detail, who drove himself without mercy and could not stop. And there were the political enemies, the knives that come out for any powerful figure in the savage arena of Washington, the columnists and rivals and operators who saw in Forrestal a target and went after him without restraint. Some of his troubles were of his own making, or arose from the genuine controversies in which his position placed him. He had taken positions on the great questions of the day that earned him powerful enemies, including on the explosive question of American policy in the Middle East, where his strategic concerns about oil and the Cold War balance led him to oppose courses of action that others fervently supported, drawing upon him the fury of influential factions. His relations with the president grew strained, the bonds of trust fraying under the pressure of disagreements and suspicions and the ordinary brutal politics of a presidential administration. Powerful newspaper columnists took up the hunt, attacking him relentlessly, hounding him in print, subjecting him to a sustained campaign of public vilification that wore at his nerves and his reputation. He was beset, embattled, exhausted, a man under siege on every front, and the siege was beginning to tell. The relentless engine that had driven him to the summit was running now at a furious and unsustainable pitch, and the man who had spent his life thinking about hidden enemies and gathering threats was beginning, under the unbearable strain, to feel those enemies and those threats closing in around him in ways that went beyond the ordinary battles of Washington, in ways that would soon carry him into a darkness no one around him could reach. The man who had built the machinery of national security, who had stared longest into the darkness of the coming struggle, who had made the Soviet threat his life's obsession, was about to discover that the burdens he had taken on were greater than any human being could bear, that the office he had created was a crushing weight, that the political knives were coming out for him in the savage arena of Washington, and that the fears and suspicions that had always lurked at the edges of his vigilant mind were beginning to grow, to spread, to take on a life of their own. The architect of the Cold War security state was beginning his descent. The watcher was about to become the watched, and the questions that would surround his final days and his mysterious and terrible end were about to begin. What was happening inside the mind of James Forrestal? What did he believe was coming for him? And how did the most powerful defense official in America fall, in a matter of months, from the summit of power into a darkness from which he would never return? The answer begins with the impossible job, and the enemies, real and imagined, who were closing in. The job that James Forrestal had taken on as the first Secretary of Defense was, as he was rapidly discovering, very nearly impossible to do, and the impossibility of it began to grind him down almost from the moment he took office. He was supposed to be the master of the entire American military establishment, the man who would bring order and unity to the Army, the Navy, and the new Air Force, who would coordinate their efforts and resolve their disputes and forge them into a single coherent instrument of national defense. But the authority he had been given was not equal to the task, and the forces arrayed against unity were powerful and entrenched and fiercely determined to resist him. The military services were ancient institutions with proud traditions and jealous pride, each convinced of its own supreme importance, each determined to protect its own budget and its own roles and its own independence, and each prepared to fight, with every weapon at its disposal, against any effort to subordinate it to a higher authority. And fight they did, ceaselessly, viciously, in a series of bitter battles that consumed Forrestal's energies and frayed his nerves and gave him no peace. The struggles were fought over money, above all, over the division of the defense budget among the rival services, and the battles grew especially savage because the budget was being squeezed. The president, determined to control federal spending and balance the budget, imposed tight ceilings on military expenditure, and the services, forced to compete for a shrinking pool of resources, turned on one another with ferocious intensity. Each fighting desperately for its share, each accusing the others of waste and folly, each appealing over Forrestal's head to the Congress and the public and anyone who would listen. Forrestal was caught in the middle of it all, squeezed between a president demanding economy and services demanding more, trying to impose a discipline he lacked the power to enforce, refereeing disputes that could not be resolved to anyone's satisfaction, absorbing the anger and the resentment of every side. The structural trap that James Forrestal found himself in was, in a sense, of his own making, the bitter fruit of the very compromise he had helped to craft. He had created an office with the responsibility to coordinate, but not the power to command, and now he was discovering, day after grinding day, exactly what that meant in practice. When the services refused to cooperate, he could exhort and persuade and cajole, but he could not truly compel. When they fought over the budget, he could propose a division, but they could simply reject it and take their case elsewhere. And take it elsewhere they did, for the services had learned, over their long histories, that the real power in Washington often lay not in the chain of command but in the Congress, in the committees that controlled the money, in the public and the press, whose support could override any decision made within the executive branch. And so, again and again, when Forrestal made a decision the services did not like, they went around him, appealing to their allies in the Congress, leaking to friendly journalists, mobilizing public pressure, undermining the very authority he was supposed to wield. An admiral or a general who disagreed with the Secretary of Defense could find a sympathetic senator, could plant a story in a newspaper, could rally the supporters of his service to fight the decision in the arena of public opinion. The result was a kind of permanent guerrilla warfare against Forrestal's authority, a constant undermining of his efforts to impose order, and there was little he could do to stop it. He was nominally the master of the military establishment, but in reality he was beset on every side by subordinates who would not obey, by services that fought him and one another, by a structure that gave him responsibility without the power to discharge it. It was a recipe for frustration and failure, and it grounded him relentlessly, day after day, wearing down his energy and his patience and his peace, a Sisyphean labor that could never be completed and never be escaped. The conflicts ran deeper than money, into the very questions of strategy and identity that defined the services and their futures. The dawn of the atomic age and the rise of air power had thrown the traditional roles of the military into question, and the services battled fiercely over who would control the new weapons and the new missions, over the shape of American defense in the nuclear era. The new Air Force, with its long-range bombers and its claim to be the decisive arm of atomic war, pressed its case for primacy and resources. The Navy, fearing for its future in a world of intercontinental air power, fought to preserve its relevance and its missions. The Army defended its own interests and its own vision. And these were not abstract debates. They were existential struggles for the services involved, struggles over their very survival and purpose, and they were waged with a bitterness and a determination that no coordinating authority could easily contain. Forrestal labored to mediate, to find compromises, to hold the fractious establishment together, but the task was Sisyphean, and the strain of it was enormous. He drove himself without mercy, as he always had, throwing the whole of his formidable energy and intelligence at the impossible problem, working punishing hours, mastering every detail, refusing to let go, refusing to rest. He had never learned how to delegate, how to step back, how to protect himself from the relentless pressure of the work. He carried it all, the budget battles and the strategic disputes, and the management of the largest military establishment on Earth, and he carried it during the most dangerous years of the early Cold War, when the threat of war with the Soviet Union hung over everything and the stakes of every decision seemed to be nothing less than the survival of the nation. The weight was crushing, and Forrestal bore it alone, in the way he had always borne his burdens, with a fierce and solitary intensity that allowed no relief. And slowly, beneath the surface, the strain began to tell. The man who had always been able to drive himself harder than anyone, to absorb any amount of pressure and keep going, was beginning, at last, to reach his limits. The toll it took on him was visible to those around him, in the deepening lines of his face, in the weariness that seemed to settle ever more heavily upon him, in the loss of the vigor and the resilience that had carried him so far. He had always been a man of immense energy, capable of working longer and harder than anyone, of absorbing pressures that would crush ordinary men and emerging seemingly untouched. But that capacity was not infinite, and the years of relentless overwork, the wartime labors followed immediately by the even more punishing burdens of the post-war period, had drained him in ways that were beginning to show. He was running on reserves that were nearly depleted, driving an engine that had been pushed too hard for too long, and the warning signs of exhaustion were everywhere, for those who knew how to read them. And he bore it all in a terrible solitude, for James Forrestal was not a man who knew how to share his burdens, to lean on others, to find comfort and relief in human connection. He had always been private and guarded, holding the world at a distance, keeping his own counsel, revealing little of his inner life even to those closest to him. His marriage offered no refuge, for it was troubled and distant, and he had few intimate friendships that might have sustained him. He carried the crushing weight of his office alone, as he had carried every burden of his life alone, with no one to share the load, no one to whom he could confess his fears and his exhaustion, no source of comfort or support to draw upon as the pressures mounted. It was a recipe for collapse, this combination of unbearable strain and utter solitude, a man stretched beyond his limits with no relief and no help, driving himself ever harder while the reserves ran dry and the darkness gathered. The very qualities that had made him formidable, the self-reliance and the iron control and the refusal to show weakness, now left him terribly exposed, alone with a burden that was becoming too heavy for any human being to bear. But the pressures of the job, crushing as they were not the only forces bearing down on James Forrestal in those years. For he had also, through the positions he took on the great questions of the day, made himself powerful and dangerous enemies. Enemies who would pursue him relentlessly and contribute to his destruction. And the most consequential of these enmities arose from his stance on one of the most explosive and emotional issues of the entire post-war period, the question of the future of the Middle East and the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. It was an issue on which Forrestal held strong views rooted in his understanding of American strategic interests, and his advocacy of those views would draw upon him a firestorm of hostility that would help to consume him. Forrestal's position arose from his role as the man responsible for American defense and his consequent preoccupation with the strategic resources and alignments on which that defense depended. He looked at the Middle East and he saw above all oil, the vast petroleum reserves of the Arab world, resources that he believed were absolutely vital to the United States, essential to the functioning of the American economy, and even more importantly, essential to the waging of any future war. In Forrestal's strategic calculus, access to Middle Eastern oil was a matter of national survival, and anything that threatened that access threatened the security of the United States itself. And he feared that American support for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine would do exactly that, alienating the Arab nations, driving them toward the Soviet Union, and jeopardizing the oil supplies on which American power depended. He argued forcefully and persistently within the inner councils of the government against the policy of supporting partition and recognizing a Jewish state, warning of what he believed would be the grave strategic consequences. To understand the position Forrestal took and the firestorm it provoked, you have to understand the genuine dilemma at its heart, a dilemma that pitted hard strategic calculation against profound moral imperatives in a way that admitted no easy resolution. Forrestal was the man responsible for the defense of the United States in the opening years of a struggle he believed could end in another world war, and he approached every question through that lens, asking always what would strengthen the nation for the conflict he saw coming and what would weaken it. Through that lens, the Middle East appeared above all as a strategic prize of immense importance, the source of the oil that would fuel any future war effort, the location of bases and alignments that could prove decisive in a contest with the Soviet Union, and he feared, genuinely and intensely, that a policy which alienated the Arab world would hand the Soviets an enormous advantage, driving the oil-rich nations toward Moscow and depriving the United States of resources it could not do without. This was the cold logic of the strategist, and within its own terms, it was coherent and serious. The reasoning of a man whose job was to think about war and oil and the hard realities of power. But it collided, head-on, with one of the most powerful moral currents of the age. For this was the immediate aftermath of the most monstrous crime in human history, the systematic murder of millions of Jews in the heart of Europe, and the movement to create a Jewish homeland carried with it the weight of that catastrophe. The desperate need of a persecuted people for a refuge and a state of their own, the moral claim of survivors who had endured the unendurable. Against that claim, arguments about oil and strategic advantage struck many as cold, even heartless. A willingness to sacrifice a people's survival on the altar of national interest. And so Forrestal found himself cast, in the eyes of his opponents, not as a careful strategist weighing hard trade-offs, but as a man who would put petroleum above human lives. And the passions the issue aroused were so intense, the stakes so charged with grief and hope and history, that there was little room for a dispassionate hearing of his strategic concerns. He had walked into the most emotionally explosive issue of his time, and it would help to destroy him. It was a position taken, in Forrestal's mind, purely on the grounds of strategy and national interest, the cold calculation of a man whose job was to think about oil and war and the hard realities of power. But it was an extraordinarily controversial position, taken on an issue of enormous moral and emotional weight, an issue bound up with the aftermath of the Holocaust and the survival of the Jewish people and the deepest passions of millions, and it placed Forrestal in opposition to a cause that commanded immense and fervent support. His advocacy made him a target of intense hostility. He was accused, by some, of allowing strategic calculation to override moral obligation, and worse, he was accused by some of his enemies of darker motives, of prejudice, accusations that wounded him deeply and that have continued to shadow his memory. Whatever the truth of his motives, and he insisted always that his concerns were strictly strategic, the practical effect was to make James Forrestal one of the most bitterly resented figures in Washington, a man with powerful and passionate enemies who would seize every opportunity to attack him. And attack him they did in a sustained and merciless campaign that would become one of the most disturbing features of his final years and one of the contributing causes of his collapse. For Forrestal became the target of some of the most powerful figures in American media, the great newspaper columnists and radio broadcasters who commanded enormous audiences and wielded enormous influence, men who could shape public opinion and destroy reputations, and who decided, for reasons of politics and ideology and personal animus, to make the destruction of James Forrestal a personal project. It is hard, from the vantage of a later age, to grasp how much power these men wielded, how formidable a weapon a hostile newspaper column or radio broadcast could be in those years. This was the era before the fragmentation of the media, when a handful of syndicated columnists and broadcasters commanded the attention of tens of millions of people, when their words reached into homes across the entire country, when what they said could shape the opinions of a nation and make or break the reputations of the powerful. The most prominent of them were figures of genuine influence, courted by politicians, feared by anyone with something to lose, capable of elevating a favorite or destroying an enemy through the sheer reach and persistence of their voice. To become the target of such a man was to face an assault that was almost impossible to counter, for he held the megaphone, and you did not. He could repeat his charges day after day to his vast audience while you had no comparable means of reply. And that was the position in which James Forrestal found himself, the target of a sustained and merciless campaign waged by men who commanded the attention of the nation and who had decided to bring him down. They returned to him again and again, week after week, never letting the assault rest, mixing fair criticism with distortion and innuendo, seizing on every controversy and every vulnerability, painting him in the darkest colors before an audience of millions. There was no escape from it, no way to make it stop, no effective means of defense. He could not silence them, could not answer them on equal terms, could not prevent the steady drip of vilification from reaching the public and shaping the way he was seen. He simply had to endure it, to absorb the blows, to watch himself be torn down before the entire country with no power to halt the destruction. For a man of pride and accomplishment, for a man who had given his life to public service, the experience was a torment, a public humiliation administered relentlessly and inescapably. And for a man whose mind was already beginning to fray under the weight of his other burdens, it was something more dangerous still. a constant assault on his sense of security and his grip on reality, a relentless confirmation of the feeling growing within him that he was surrounded by enemies who were determined to destroy him. They attacked him relentlessly, in column after column and broadcast after broadcast, subjecting him to a campaign of vilification that was unrelenting in its intensity and devastating in its effect. The attacks were vicious and often unfair, mixing legitimate criticism with distortion and innuendo and outright falsehood, painting Forrestal as a sinister and malevolent figure, impugning his character and his motives, holding him up to public scorn and ridicule. The most powerful of these columnists pursued him with a particular ferocity, hounding him week after week, seizing on every vulnerability, amplifying every controversy, never relenting in the campaign to bring him down. For a man already under enormous strain, already stretched to his limits by the crushing burdens of his office, this sustained public assault was a torment almost beyond bearing. To open the newspaper and find oneself attacked, to hear oneself vilified on the radio, to know that millions of people were being told terrible things about you, day after day after day, with no respite and no escape, would test the resilience of the strongest man, and Forrestal was no longer at his strongest. The relentless campaign wore at him, fed his sense of being beset by enemies, deepened the strain that was slowly pulling him apart. And then came the political earthquake that would fatally undermine his position and accelerate his fall, the presidential election that defied every expectation and left James Forrestal exposed and vulnerable as never before. As the election approached, the conventional wisdom held that the incumbent president was doomed, that he would surely be defeated by his challenger, and much of the American establishment, the world of finance and business and high officialdom to which Forrestal belonged, prepared for a change of administration. Forrestal himself, it appears, shared this expectation, and like many establishment figures, he seems to have positioned himself with an eye to the future he believed was coming, hedging his bets, maintaining his relationships with the men he expected to take power, perhaps imagining that he might continue in high office under the new administration that everyone assumed was on its way. But the conventional wisdom was wrong, spectacularly wrong, and the election produced one of the greatest upsets in the history of American politics. The incumbent president, written off by nearly everyone, won a stunning come-from-behind victory, confounding the pollsters and the pundits and the entire political establishment. And for James Forrestal, the result was a disaster. The president he had served, but with whom his relationship had grown strained and distrustful, the president whose policies he had sometimes opposed and whose political fortunes he had perhaps quietly doubted, was now triumphantly returned to power, vindicated and strengthened, with no reason to feel any loyalty toward a defense secretary who was widely associated with the opposition and who had clashed with him on matters of policy and principle. Forrestal's position, already weakened by the controversies and the enmities he had accumulated, was now fatally compromised. He had bet, in effect, on the wrong outcome, and he had lost. The miscalculation was not Forrestal's alone, of course. Nearly the entire political and financial establishment had been certain the incumbent would lose, had read the polls and the conventional wisdom and concluded that a change of administration was inevitable, and had positioned themselves accordingly. But for most of them, the error carried no great cost. They could adjust, make their peace with the unexpected result, continue on with their lives and careers. For James Forrestal, the situation was very different, because he held one of the highest offices in the government, an office that served at the pleasure of the very president whose victory he had failed to anticipate and whose policies he had sometimes opposed. And his miscalculation had left him dangerously exposed. The president who emerged triumphant from that election was a man who knew his own mind, who valued loyalty, and who now possessed both the political strength and the popular mandate to surround himself with people he trusted. He looked at his Secretary of Defense, and he saw a man associated with the opposition, a man who had clashed with him on matters of policy, a man whose loyalty he had reason to question, a holdover from a different vision of the administration's future. There was little in that assessment to recommend Forrestal's retention, and a great deal to recommend his replacement. The unexpected victory had transformed the political landscape, and in the new landscape, James Forrestal had no secure place. He had spent his career navigating the corridors of power, reading the shifting currents of influence, positioning himself with care, and now, through a single great misreading of the political moment, he found himself stranded, his footing gone, his position untenable, dependent for his survival on the goodwill of a president who had every reason to feel none toward him. The ground had shifted beneath him, and he was falling, and there was nothing he could do to arrest the descent. The president, freshly empowered by his unexpected victory, had both the political strength and the personal inclination to make changes, and James Forrestal was an obvious candidate for removal. The relationship between the two men had deteriorated badly, There were policy disagreements, there were questions about Forrestal's loyalty and his political maneuvering. There was the simple reality that a triumphant president wanted his own people in the key positions of his administration. And so the decision was made. The president determined to replace Forrestal as Secretary of Defense, to remove him from the office he had done so much to create, and to install in his place a man of the president's own choosing, a political ally who had helped him in his campaign. For Forrestal, who had given everything to his work, who had built the office and the institutions and poured his life into the defense of the nation, the prospect of removal was a devastating blow, a repudiation, a rejection that struck at the very core of his identity and his sense of purpose. It is worth pausing here to consider the accumulating weight of what was bearing down on James Forrestal in these months, because it helps to explain the catastrophe that was coming. He was a man under siege from every direction at once. The crushing, impossible burdens of his office pressed down on him relentlessly, the endless battles and the unmanageable responsibilities and the strain of carrying the defense of the nation in its most dangerous hour. The vicious campaign of the columnists assaulted him week after week, vilifying him before the public, feeding his sense of being surrounded by enemies. The political ground had shifted beneath his feet, the unexpected election result leaving him exposed and discredited. And now the ultimate blow was falling, the removal from office, the rejection by the president he had served, the loss of the position that had become the center of his existence. Any one of these burdens would have been heavy. Together, falling upon a man already stretched beyond his limits, already exhausted and depleted by years of relentless overwork, they were overwhelming. And beneath the surface, in the depths of his troubled and exhausted mind, something was beginning to break. The signs had been accumulating for some time, visible to those who knew him well and looked closely, signs that the man was not well, that the relentless pressures were taking a toll that went beyond ordinary fatigue. He had grown haggard and drawn, worn down by overwork and worry. There was a haunted quality to him, a sense of a man carrying burdens too heavy to bear. He had always been intense and driven, but the intensity had taken on a darker cast, an edge of something troubled and fearful. And those closest to him began to notice with growing alarm that his behavior was changing, that he seemed increasingly preoccupied and anxious, that the vigilance and the suspicion that had always been part of his character were deepening into something more disturbing. The man who had spent his career thinking about enemies and threats was beginning to see them everywhere, beginning to feel them closing in around him, beginning to lose the ability to distinguish between the real dangers of his position and the imagined dangers that his exhausted and overwrought mind was conjuring. There was a terrible and poignant continuity in this, a way in which the breakdown of James Forrestal's mind seemed to grow directly out of the very qualities that had defined his life and his work. He had spent decades training himself to see threats, to anticipate dangers, to think always about the hidden enemies and the looming perils that a man responsible for national defense must keep ever in view. Vigilance had been his profession and his temperament, the constant scanning of the horizon for signs of menace, the habit of taking seriously the possibility that powerful and hostile forces were working in secret against the things he sought to protect. In his years at the summit of the security state, this vigilance had been an asset, even a necessity, the proper cast of mind for a man charged with guarding the nation against real and formidable adversaries. But there is a fine line between vigilance and paranoia, between the rational anticipation of genuine threats and the delusional conviction that one is surrounded by enemies. And as Forrestal's mind began to give way under the unbearable strain, that line began to blur and then to dissolve entirely. The habits of a lifetime, the constant attention to hidden dangers, the readiness to believe in secret conspiracies, turned inward and ran wild, no longer disciplined by judgment and reason, no longer anchored to the real world. The threats he had always watched for began to seem to be everywhere, closing in on him personally, and his exhausted mind, stripped of its defenses by depression and despair, could no longer distinguish between the real dangers of his fallen position and the phantoms his illness was generating. It was as though the very machinery of his mind, the apparatus of vigilance he had built over a lifetime, had broken loose and turned against him, filling his world with enemies and conspiracies and persecution, transforming the watchful guardian of the nation into a terrified man, convinced that he himself was being hunted. The tragedy of it was profound, the way his greatest strengths had become, in the breaking, the instruments of his torment, the way the mind that had served the nation so well now turned upon its owner and would not let him rest. The moment that revealed to the world how far he had fallen came at the ceremony that marked his departure from office. It should have been an occasion of honor and dignity, a fitting tribute to a man who had served his country at the highest levels through years of war and crisis, who had built the institutions of national defense and led them through the perilous early years of the Cold War. He was to be honored, to receive the recognition due to a great public servant at the close of his service. But what those present witnessed was something deeply troubling, something that signaled that all was not well with James Forrestal. For during the ceremony, at the moment that should have been the culmination of his career, Forrestal seemed to be somewhere else entirely. Frozen, unresponsive, lost in some private darkness. He sat as though stunned, unable to react, seemingly unaware of what was being said to him and around him. His face a mask, his mind apparently far away. Those who saw it were disturbed, for it was unmistakable that something was profoundly wrong, that the man before them was not himself, that beneath the surface some terrible crisis was unfolding. And then, with his service ended and the structure of his life suddenly removed, with the office that had defined and ordered his existence taken away, James Forrestal collapsed. The removal from power, coming on top of everything else, seems to have been the final blow that shattered whatever remained of his ability to hold himself together. He had been running for so long on the relentless energy of the work, on the pressure and the purpose of his office, and now that the work was gone, now that the structure was removed, there was nothing left to hold back the darkness that had been gathering within him. His mental state deteriorated with terrifying speed. The exhaustion and the strain and the accumulated burdens crashed down upon him all at once, and the troubled vigilance that had been deepening for months gave way to something far more severe, a full and frightening descent into a state of profound distress and paranoia. Concerned for his well-being, his friends and associates arranged for him to be taken away from Washington to rest, to a place of quiet and retreat where they hoped he might recover, a peaceful spot far from the pressures that had broken him. But the change of scene brought no relief, and what unfolded there revealed the full and alarming extent of his collapse. For James Forrestal, in that place of supposed rest and recovery, was gripped by terror and delusion. He had become convinced that he was in danger, that enemies were pursuing him, that he was being watched and hunted, that forces were closing in to destroy him. He reacted with fear to ordinary sounds and ordinary sights, interpreting them as signs of the threats he believed surrounded him. He spoke of being pursued, of enemies coming for him, his exhausted and overwrought mind transforming the world around him into a landscape of menace and conspiracy. The man who had spent his life vigilant against hidden threats was now consumed by the conviction that the threats had come for him, that he was the target of a vast and shadowy persecution, and the terror of it gripped him completely. Try for a moment to imagine the experience of it from the inside, the sheer horror of what James Forrestal was enduring in those days, because it is the only way to grasp the depth of his suffering. To be in the grip of such a delusion is to live in a world transformed into a nightmare, where every shadow conceals a threat, where every sound is a warning, where the people around you may be agents of your destruction, and the very walls may be listening. It is to be afraid, constantly and overwhelmingly afraid, with a fear that has no off switch and no refuge, a fear that fills every waking moment and follows you into sleep. The mind, which should be a place of refuge, becomes instead a chamber of horrors, generating terrors without end, and there is no escape from it, because the source of the terror is within, traveling with you wherever you go. And layered over the terror was the crushing weight of the depression itself, the profound and suffocating despair that is the core of the illness that had seized him, a darkness that drains away all hope and all pleasure and all sense that things might ever be better. Depression of this severity is not ordinary sadness, not a passing low mood that time and rest will heal. It is a devastating affliction that distorts the entire experience of being alive, that fills the mind with hopelessness and self-reproach and a sense of unendurable suffering, that can make existence itself feel like a torment beyond bearing. James Forrestal was suffering both at once, the paranoid terror and the abyssal despair, the conviction that enemies were hunting him and the crushing certainty that all was lost, and the combination must have been very nearly unbearable. He was a man in profound agony, suffering an anguish of the mind as real and as terrible as any physical pain, and he was suffering it largely alone, trapped within a mind that had turned against him. It is impossible to contemplate his condition in those days without a deep and aching compassion for what this brilliant and accomplished man was being forced to endure. It was, in the clearest and most compassionate terms, a severe mental health crisis, the breakdown of a brilliant and overburdened mind under the weight of unbearable strain. The man was profoundly ill, suffering from a serious affliction of the mind, the kind of crushing depression and paranoid distress that can overtake anyone pushed beyond their limits, that has nothing to do with weakness of character and everything to do with the terrible vulnerability of the human mind under extreme and sustained pressure. James Forrestal was not a weak man. He was, by any measure, a man of extraordinary strength and ability who had accomplished great things through sheer force of will and intelligence, but none of that protected him because the illness that had overtaken him does not respect strength or accomplishment, can strike the strongest and most capable as readily as anyone, and had now descended upon him with devastating force. He needed help, urgent and serious help, the care of those who understood the affliction that had seized him. And so his friends and family, deeply alarmed by what they were witnessing, by the depth of his distress and the severity of his delusions, made the decision that he required hospitalization, that he needed to be placed under proper medical care, that the crisis had passed beyond anything that rest alone could address. They arranged for him to be brought to a hospital, to be admitted for treatment of the severe depression and the paranoid distress that had overwhelmed him. It was a wrenching decision, the recognition that one of the most powerful men in America, a towering figure of the establishment, had been brought so low that he required confinement and medical care for a collapse of the mind. But there was no choice. The man was in crisis, in genuine danger, and he needed the kind of help that only a hospital could provide. The decision to hospitalize him was fraught with difficulty and delicacy, for this was no ordinary patient, and the implications of his confinement reached far beyond the medical. James Forrestal had only just stepped down as the first Secretary of Defense. He had been, until weeks before, one of the most powerful men in the United States, a figure who knew the nation's most closely guarded secrets, who had sat at the center of the Cold War security apparatus, whose mind contained a vast store of classified knowledge about the workings of American power. That such a man had suffered a complete mental collapse, that he was being confined to a hospital in a state of paranoid delusion, was a matter of the utmost sensitivity, charged with concerns about his dignity, about national security, about the political reverberations that might follow if the full truth of his condition became widely known. And so there was a powerful impulse toward discretion, toward managing the situation quietly, toward shielding both the man and the government from the consequences of full disclosure. He was placed in a special suite high in the hospital tower, set apart where his treatment could proceed away from public view and where his importance and his need for privacy could be accommodated. The hope, of course, was for recovery, for healing, for the restoration of a great man brought low by illness. Severe depression, even in that era of more limited treatment, was not necessarily a permanent condition. People did recover, did emerge from the darkness, did return to health and even to productive life. And there were reasons for cautious optimism in Forrestal's case, signs, in the weeks that followed his admission, that the treatment was helping, that the worst of the crisis might be passing, that the man might yet be brought back from the abyss into which he had fallen. He was receiving care, he was under the supervision of specialists, he was in a place of safety, removed from the pressures that had broken him. There was reason to hope that he would recover, that this dark chapter would end not in tragedy, but in healing, that James Forrestal would in time return from the hospital restored to himself. But that hope, as events would prove, was tragically misplaced, and the story of his confinement would end not in recovery, but in a death that would shock the nation and give rise to questions that have never been laid to rest. He was admitted to a military hospital in the nation's capital, a great medical center where the most senior figures of the government received their care. And he was placed in a special suite high in the hospital tower, reserved for patients of his importance, where he would be treated for his condition under the supervision of the hospital's specialists. The diagnosis was severe depression, the profound and crushing form of the illness that can rob a person of all hope and all peace, that can fill the mind with despair and dread, that in its most severe forms can become life-threatening. He was placed under treatment, under the care of the physicians who would attempt to bring him back from the darkness, to heal the mind that had broken under the unbearable weight of his final years in power. And there, in that high hospital suite, the last chapter of James Forrestal's life began to unfold, a chapter that would end in tragedy and mystery, in a death that would never be fully explained and that would spawn questions and suspicions lasting for generations. For the weeks that James Forrestal would spend in that hospital would be the final weeks of his life, and the manner of his death, when it came, would be shrouded in circumstances strange and terrible enough to fuel speculation that has never entirely died away. He had been one of the most powerful men in America, the architect of the national security state, the keeper of the nation's deepest secrets, and now he lay in a hospital bed, broken in mind, convinced that enemies were pursuing him, under treatment for a crushing depression that had stripped away everything he had been. What was happening in that troubled and brilliant mind? Were his fears the pure delusions of his illness? Or was there buried somewhere in his vast knowledge of the secret workings of American power some real foundation for his terror? Was he simply a sick man, or a sick man who also knew too much? And what would happen in those final weeks high in the hospital tower that would end his life and begin a mystery that endures to this day? The answers, such as they are, lie in the strange and tragic final days of James Forrestal and in the questions that his death left behind. In the weeks that followed his admission to the hospital, James Forrestal settled into the strange new rhythm of life as a patient. A man confined and cared for, removed from the world of power he had inhabited for so long, given over to the slow and uncertain work of healing. He was housed in the special suite high in the hospital tower, attended by the physicians and staff responsible for his treatment, subjected to the regimen of care that the medicine of that era prescribed for the severe depression that had overwhelmed him. It was a profound reversal of everything his life had been. The man who had commanded armies and built institutions and carried the secrets of the nation, now a patient in a hospital ward, his days structured around treatment and observation and rest, his terrible burdens lifted at last, but at the cost of his freedom and his standing, and it must have seemed to him in his darkest moments, his very identity. And for a time, the treatment seemed to be working. This is one of the cruelest aspects of the entire tragedy. The fact that in the weeks of his confinement, James Forrestal appeared to be improving, appeared to be climbing slowly back from the abyss into which he had fallen. The acute terror of his initial collapse seemed to ease. The paranoid delusions that had gripped him appeared to loosen their hold. He grew calmer, more himself, more able to engage with the people around him, to read, to converse, to take an interest in the world once more. Those who treated him and those who visited him noted the signs of progress, the gradual return of the man they had known, and they began to allow themselves to hope that the worst had passed, that the crisis was resolving, that James Forrestal would recover and emerge from the hospital restored, that this dark episode would prove to be a passing affliction rather than a permanent ruin. There is a terrible irony embedded in this apparent recovery, one that anyone who has studied the cruelties of severe depression will recognize. For the illness that had seized James Forrestal does not always lift in a clean and steady line, and the appearance of improvement can be deceptive, even dangerous. In some cases, the lifting of the deepest paralysis of depression, the return of some energy and some capacity for action, can come before the return of hope, leaving a person less crushed and immobile but still trapped in despair, now with the renewed capacity to act upon it. The very signs that look like recovery, the calm, the engagement, the return of function, can in some tragic cases mask a danger that has not passed but only changed its form. This is one of the most insidious features of the illness, the way it can seem to release its grip even as it remains lethal, the way the appearance of healing can lull everyone, the patient and the physicians and the family alike, into a false sense of security. Whether this dynamic was at work in the case of James Forrestal cannot be known with certainty, but the pattern of his final weeks, the apparent improvement followed by sudden catastrophe, is one that has tragically recurred in countless cases of severe depression, and it speaks to the treacherous and unpredictable nature of the affliction. The hope that his family and his physicians allowed themselves was reasonable, grounded in genuine signs of progress, and yet it proved to be tragically misplaced. The man seemed to be getting better, and then he was gone. It is a reminder, sobering and sad, of how little was understood in that era about the illness that had taken hold of him, of how limited the tools were to treat it and to guard against its dangers, and of how a devastating depression can hide its lethality behind a mask of recovery, deceiving everyone until it is too late. The optimism of those final weeks, the belief that the worst had passed, would make the blow of his death all the more shattering when it came. There was talk of his eventual discharge, of his return to private life, of the future that might still await him once he had fully healed. His family and friends who had watched his collapse with such anguish began to breathe more easily, encouraged by the reports of his improvement, daring to believe that the man they loved was coming back to them. The treatment appeared to be succeeding, the darkness appeared to be lifting, and after the terror and despair of his collapse, there was, at last, reason for optimism. James Forrestal, it seemed, was going to be all right. He was getting better. He was going to recover. And it was precisely at this moment, precisely when the hope was brightest and the danger seemed to be passing, that the unthinkable happened. For, in the early hours of a May morning in 1949, after weeks in the hospital, after the slow climb back toward health, after the flickering return of hope, James Forrestal died. He took his own life. He was 57 years old. The man who had risen from a small town in the Hudson Valley to the very summit of American power, who had built the fleet that won the Pacific War and the institutions that would wage the Cold War, who had been the first Secretary of Defense of the United States, was gone, lost at last to the darkness that had been gathering within him for so long. The circumstances of his death were stark and terrible, and there is no need to dwell upon their details. What matters, what must be understood and held with compassion, is that a brilliant and accomplished and profoundly tormented man, in the grip of a devastating illness that had stripped away his hope and his peace and his will to go on, had reached the end of what he could endure, and the illness had claimed him, as it claims so many, a casualty of an affliction of the mind as deadly as any disease of the body. It is essential to hold on to this understanding, to resist the temptation to see his death as anything other than what it was, the fatal outcome of a genuine and devastating illness. There is a long and cruel history of misunderstanding deaths like Forrestal's, of treating them as failures of character or will, as acts of cowardice or weakness, as moral failings rather than medical tragedies. But this understanding is false, and it does a profound injustice to those who suffer and to those who are lost. James Forrestal did not die because he was weak. He was, by every measure of his life, a man of extraordinary strength, a man who had accomplished more through sheer will and ability than almost anyone of his generation. He died because he was ill, because a disease of the mind had overwhelmed him, a disease that can kill as surely and as indiscriminately as any cancer or any plague, that strikes the strong and the accomplished and the brilliant, that respects nothing and spares no one by virtue of their gifts or their achievements. The depression that destroyed James Forrestal was a medical condition, an affliction of the brain and the mind, and his death was its fatal complication, the tragic endpoint of an illness that had run its devastating course. To understand it this way is not to diminish the tragedy, but to see it clearly, with the compassion it deserves, and to honor the man not by pretending his death was something other than it was, but by recognizing the terrible affliction that took him and the suffering he endured. He was a casualty, a man lost to an illness that the medicine of his time could not save him from, and his death deserves to be met not with judgment or with sensational speculation, but with sorrow, and with a clear-eyed recognition of the deadly seriousness of the condition that claimed him. He had given his country everything he had, and in the end he was destroyed by a sickness that no amount of strength or service or accomplishment could hold at bay. There is a detail surrounding his final hours that has haunted all who have contemplated his death, a detail of almost unbearable poignancy that speaks more eloquently than any clinical account to the depth of the despair that had engulfed him. In the time before he died, James Forrestal had been engaged in a quiet and solitary task. He had been copying out by his own hand the words of an ancient tragedy. A mournful passage from one of the great dramas of the classical Greek world, a chorus steeped in sorrow and suffering and the longing for release. Line by line, he had been transcribing the ancient poetry of grief, the words of a hero brought low and contemplating the end of his torment, and he had stopped partway through, leaving the transcription unfinished, the task abandoned in the middle, the words trailing off into silence. It is an image of devastating sadness, the broken and brilliant man alone in the night, copying out the ancient verses of despair, finding in the words of a tragedy written thousands of years before some reflection of the darkness that had overtaken his own soul. And in that unfinished transcription, that interrupted act, there is a glimpse, terrible and intimate, of the anguish of a mind at the very end of its endurance. The death of James Forrestal sent a shock through the nation and through the world. He had been, until weeks before, one of the most powerful men in the United States, a towering figure of the establishment. And now he was dead by his own hand, a victim of a collapse that few had understood and that had unfolded largely out of public view. The news was greeted with grief and disbelief and a profound sense of tragedy. The fall of a great public servant who had given everything to his country and been destroyed by the burdens he had carried. There was an outpouring of tributes, of recognition for his service and his accomplishments, of sorrow at the terrible manner of his passing. And there was, inevitably, a reckoning with the question of how it had happened, how a man of such strength and ability had come to such an end, what had driven him into the darkness that had finally consumed him. The official response was to convene an investigation, a formal review board to examine the circumstances of his death, and to render a finding as to what had occurred. The board conducted its inquiry, examined the evidence, considered the medical history of his illness and the circumstances of his confinement and his death, and reached its conclusion. James Forrestal, the board found, had taken his own life while suffering from severe depression, the affliction that had overwhelmed his mind and stripped away his will to live. It was a finding consistent with everything that was known about his collapse, his hospitalization, the diagnosis of his illness, the terrible trajectory of his final months. He had been gravely ill in a way that can prove fatal, and the illness had killed him, as such illnesses do. The official record was clear, the findings straightforward, the tragedy explained in the terms of medicine and mental illness. He had been a sick man, and his sickness had destroyed him. The investigation that reached this conclusion was conducted according to the standards and the understanding of its time, an era in which the science of the mind was far less developed than it is today, in which the nature and the treatment of severe mental illness were only dimly understood. The physicians who had treated Forrestal, the board that examined the circumstances of his death, worked with the knowledge available to them, and they reached the conclusion that the evidence supported that a man suffering from a grave depression had succumbed to his illness. They did not have the tools or the understanding that later generations would develop. The deeper knowledge of the biology of depression, the more effective treatments, the better means of assessing and guarding against the dangers of the condition. They did the best they could with what they knew, and what they concluded was, in all likelihood, the simple truth. And the truth, however much it has been obscured by decades of speculation, is a deeply human and deeply tragic one. A brilliant and driven man who had pushed himself relentlessly for decades, who had carried burdens that would have broken most people, who had finally reached the limits of what even his formidable constitution could bear, fell into a devastating depression that overwhelmed his mind and, in the end, took his life. There is no conspiracy required to explain it, No hidden plot, no sinister machination. The explanation lies in the all-too-human reality of mental illness, in the terrible vulnerability of even the strongest minds, in the way that unbearable strain and accumulated trauma and the chemistry of despair can combine to destroy a person from within. James Forrestal was a casualty of that reality, one of countless people across history brought down by an affliction that is as old as humanity and that remains, even now, imperfectly understood and tragically common. He was a sick man, and his sickness killed him, and that simple and sorrowful truth is the heart of the matter, however much the world has wished to make it into something stranger and more sinister. And yet, almost from the moment of his death, the official explanation failed to satisfy everyone. And around the death of James Forrestal, there began to gather a fog of suspicion and speculation and doubt that is never entirely lifted, that persists to this day, that has made his death one of the enduring mysteries of American history. For there were aspects of the case that seemed to some to invite questions, circumstances that struck observers as strange or troubling or insufficiently explained, and into the space of those questions rushed a flood of theories and suspicions, some sober and some wild, some grounded in genuine puzzlement, and some spun from the darker recesses of the conspiratorial imagination. The death of the first Secretary of Defense, it turned out, would not rest quietly as a simple tragedy of illness. It would become a mystery, a subject of endless speculation, a puzzle that people would worry at for generations. The reasons for this are not difficult to understand, and they go to the very heart of what made James Forrestal who he was. Here was a man who had stood at the absolute center of the American national security state, who had known its deepest secrets, who had been privy to the most classified information about the workings of American power, the intelligence operations, the military plans, the hidden machinery of the early Cold War. Here was a man who, in his final illness, had become convinced that he was being watched and pursued, that enemies were closing in on him, that he was the target of a vast and shadowy persecution. And here was a man who had made powerful and passionate enemies, who had taken controversial positions on explosive issues, who had been hounded by his foes and removed from power under troubling circumstances. When such a man dies suddenly and violently, when a keeper of the nation's secrets who believed himself to be hunted meets a tragic end, it is perhaps inevitable that questions will arise, that some will wonder whether his fears were entirely groundless, whether there was something more to his death than the official account allowed. The psychology of this suspicion is worth examining, because it reveals something about how the human mind responds to the deaths of the powerful and the mysterious. When an ordinary person dies of an illness, however tragic, we accept it as the sad but unremarkable working of fate. But when a figure of great power and great secrets dies suddenly and violently, especially one who had spoken, however irrationally, of being pursued and watched, the mind rebels against the simple explanation. It seems too convenient, too neat, that a man who believed he was being hunted should die in a manner that, to the suspicious eye, might look like the very thing he feared. The coincidence feels significant, charged with hidden meaning, and the imagination rushes to fill the gap between the official account and the gnawing sense that there must be more to the story. And in Forrestal's case, the raw materials for suspicion were unusually abundant. He had been at the center of the most secret operations of the government. He had carried knowledge that powerful people might conceivably have wished to keep buried. He had made bitter enemies, had taken dangerous positions, had been removed from power under troubling circumstances, and then had died, all within a span of weeks, in a manner that shocked the nation. For a mind inclined to see hidden hands at work in the affairs of the powerful, the pattern seemed to cry out for a deeper explanation, and the fact that the man himself had insisted, in his final weeks, that enemies were closing in lent his death a terrible ambiguity. Was he simply a sick man whose paranoid fears happened to precede a tragic death from his illness, or had there been buried somewhere in the strange convergence of his secrets and his enemies and his fall, some grain of reality in his terror? The official account said one thing, and the evidence supported it, but the questions would not be stilled because the circumstances seemed, to the suspicious imagination, to whisper of something the official account had missed. And so the theories proliferated, multiplying over the years into a whole literature of suspicions surrounding the death of James Forrestal. There were those who suggested that he had been silenced, murdered to prevent him from revealing the secrets he carried, the dangerous knowledge locked in his mind about the hidden workings of American power. There were those who connected his death to the controversial positions he had taken, who speculated that he had been killed by agents of one faction or another that he had crossed, that his stance on the great and contentious issues of his day had marked him for elimination. There were those who wove his death into the grand conspiracy theories of the Cold War, casting him as a man who knew too much and was eliminated by forces foreign or domestic to keep him quiet. And in later years, his name would even be drawn into some of the strangest and most outlandish conspiracy theories of the age. Theories involving secret government programs and hidden knowledge of matters far stranger than ordinary espionage. his death repurposed as evidence in fantasies that had nothing to do with the actual circumstances of his life and his illness? It is important to be clear and honest about these theories, to neither dismiss the genuine questions out of hand, nor lend credence to claims for which there is no evidence. The documented record, the medical history, the investigation, all point to the same tragic conclusion, that James Forrestal died by his own hand as a consequence of a severe and devastating mental illness. The evidence for the conspiracy theories, the claims of murder and silencing and elaborate plots, is essentially non-existent, built on speculation and suspicion and the irresistible human impulse to find hidden meaning in the deaths of the powerful. There is no credible evidence that James Forrestal was murdered, no proof of any plot, nothing to substantiate the darker theories beyond the strangeness of the circumstances and the secrets the man had carried. The overwhelming likelihood, the conclusion supported by the actual evidence, is the tragic and simple one, that a brilliant man was destroyed by a terrible illness, that his death was exactly what the official findings said it was. It is worth dwelling for a moment on how to think clearly about a case like this, because it offers a lesson that extends far beyond the death of one man. The honest approach is neither to mock those who ask questions, nor to indulge claims that have no evidence behind them, but to hold the two things in proper balance, to acknowledge that the circumstances were genuinely strange and that the questions are understandable, while insisting that strangeness and suspicion are not evidence, that the absence of a satisfying explanation is not proof of a sinister one. The human mind craves meaning, craves narrative, craves the sense that significant events have significant causes, and it recoils from the idea that a great and powerful man might be undone by something as mundane and as random as the chemistry of a diseased mind. There is a kind of comfort, perverse as it may seem, in the conspiracy theory, for it imposes order and intention on a death that otherwise seems senseless. It transforms a meaningless tragedy into a meaningful crime. But the comfort of the conspiracy theory is a false comfort, and the discipline of honest thinking requires resisting it. The death of James Forrestal was investigated, the evidence was examined, and the conclusion reached was the one the evidence supported. To set that conclusion aside in favor of theories for which there is no proof, however emotionally satisfying those theories might be, is to abandon reason for the seductions of suspicion. The questions about his death are understandable, and the circumstances were genuinely troubling, and it is no crime to wonder. But wondering is not knowing, and the responsible verdict, the verdict that the actual evidence compels, is the tragic and simple one. A brilliant man was destroyed by a terrible illness. That is what the evidence shows, and no amount of speculation, however ingenious or however appealing, can change it into something else. The mystery of James Forrestal's death is, in the end, less a mystery about what happened to him than a mystery about why we find it so hard to accept the painful truth. But understanding why the questions persist, why the speculation has never died, tells us something profound about the world that James Forrestal helped to create, and here we arrive at one of the deepest and most haunting ironies of his entire story. The fog of suspicion that surrounds his death, the inability of so many to accept the simple and tragic truth, is itself a product of the very thing he built. For James Forrestal was one of the principal architects of the secret state, the apparatus of classified information and covert operations and hidden power that he helped to construct in those crucial post-war years. And one of the inevitable consequences of such an apparatus, one of the corrosive effects of a vast machinery of government secrecy, is precisely the breeding of suspicion and conspiracy and doubt. When so much is hidden, when the government operates through secret channels and classified programs and covert operations, when the public is told that there are things it cannot know, then trust erodes. And into the space left by official secrecy rushes an endless proliferation of theories and suspicions about what is really going on behind the curtain. The secret state that Forrestal built, in other words, created the very conditions in which the conspiracy theories about his own death could flourish. A society accustomed to government secrecy, to hidden operations and classified truths, to the knowledge that powerful forces work in the shadows beyond public view, is a society primed to suspect that any strange death, any troubling event, any unexplained circumstance might conceal a darker truth. The machinery of secrecy breeds the culture of conspiracy, and James Forrestal, the architect of so much of that machinery, became, in his death, one of its earliest and most enduring objects. The man who helped to build the apparatus of official secrecy was consumed, in the public memory, by the very suspicion that such secrecy inevitably generates. It is a strange and fitting irony, the builder of the secret state becoming a permanent mystery, his death forever shrouded in the fog of speculation that his own creation did so much to produce. This dynamic, the way official secrecy breeds public suspicion, is one of the most important and least appreciated consequences of the secret state, and it has only grown more powerful in the decades since Forrestal's death. A government that operates through classified programs and covert operations and hidden truths, that tells its citizens there are vast areas of its activity they are not permitted to know about, inevitably forfeits a measure of the public's trust. For when people know that secrets are being kept, when they understand that powerful institutions work in the shadows beyond their view, they naturally begin to wonder what those secrets are, and to suspect that the truths being hidden from them might be darker and more troubling than they are told. Every revelation of a genuine government secret, every exposure of a real covert operation that had been concealed, confirms the suspicion that there is more beneath the surface, and feeds the appetite for theories about what else might be hidden. And so the machinery of secrecy generates, as an inevitable byproduct, a culture of conspiracy, a pervasive sense that the official story is never the whole story, that powerful forces are always working in concealment, that the truth is always being managed and hidden and spun. The secret state, built to protect the nation, corrodes the trust between the government and the governed, and into the resulting void floods an endless stream of suspicion and speculation and conspiracy, some of it justified by real abuses and some of it pure fantasy, but all of it nourished by the basic reality that so much is genuinely hidden. James Forrestal helped to build the apparatus of official secrecy, and his death became one of its early casualties in the realm of public trust, an event that the machinery of secrecy ensured could never be accepted at face value. The fog that surrounds his death is the same fog that surrounds so much of what the secret state does, the fog of suspicion that is the unavoidable price of a government that keeps its citizens in the dark, and that fog has only thickened in the generations since, until we now live in an age where trust in official accounts has worn perilously thin and conspiracy theories flourish as never before, a condition whose roots reach back, in part, to the very apparatus that men like Forrestal created. And there is a deeper irony still, the most haunting of all, that lies at the very center of the tragedy of James Forrestal. For consider the nature of his collapse, the specific form that his madness took. He did not simply fall into despair. He fell into paranoia, into the consuming conviction that he was being watched, that he was being followed, that enemies and agents were closing in on him, that he was the target of a vast and hidden persecution. He came to believe, in the grip of his illness, that the very kinds of forces he had spent his career thinking about, the secret agents, the hidden enemies, the shadowy conspiracies, had turned their attention upon him personally. The man who had built the apparatus of surveillance and secret operations came to believe that he himself was under surveillance. The watcher became the watched. The architect of the secret state became convinced that the secret state, or forces like it, were hunting him down. There is something almost unbearably profound in this, a tragedy that seems to carry a terrible meaning beyond the merely personal. James Forrestal had spent his life immersed in a world of threats and enemies and hidden dangers, had trained his mind to see conspiracy and menace everywhere, had built the very institutions whose business was secrecy and surveillance and covert action. And in the end, that entire mental world, that whole apparatus of vigilance and suspicion, turned inward and consumed him, filling his mind with the very phantoms his life's work had been concerned with, transforming him from the master of the secret state into its imagined victim. It is as though the machinery of fear that he had helped to build, the whole Cold War apparatus of threat and counter-threat and hidden menace, had taken up residence in his own mind and driven him mad, as though he had stared so long into the abyss of secret warfare that the abyss had finally stared back and claimed him. The architect of the national security state was destroyed by a paranoia that mirrored, in the chamber of his own broken mind, the very world of secrecy and suspicion that he had done so much to create. There is a way of reading the tragedy of James Forrestal that sees in it something larger than the story of one man's illness, that finds in his fate a kind of dark parable about the entire enterprise to which he gave his life. He had devoted himself to the construction of a vast machinery of vigilance, an apparatus built on the premise that the world was full of hidden enemies and secret threats, that constant watchfulness and suspicion were the price of survival in a dangerous age. He had immersed himself, day after day, year after year, in a mental universe of menace and conspiracy and concealed danger, training his mind to see threats everywhere, to take seriously the possibility that powerful and hostile forces were always working in secret against the things he sought to protect. It was the necessary cast of mind for the work he did, and he did that work brilliantly. But it was also, perhaps, a dangerous way to live, a habit of mind that, carried far enough and pushed hard enough, could turn upon itself. And in the end, in the breaking of his mind, that is exactly what seems to have happened. The vigilance became paranoia. The watchfulness for hidden enemies became the delusion that hidden enemies were everywhere, closing in, hunting him down. The mental world of secret threat and concealed menace that he had inhabited for his entire career broke loose from its moorings and flooded his consciousness, transforming the watchful guardian into a terrified victim, the master of the secret state into a man convinced he was its prey. He had stared into the abyss of secret warfare, into the dark world of espionage and covert operations and hidden enemies, for so long and so intently that, when his mind gave way, the abyss seemed to stare back into him, filling his thoughts with the very phantoms his life's work had concerned itself with. It is as though the machinery of fear he had helped to build had a logic of its own, a logic that, once it took hold of a vulnerable mind, could drive that mind to madness, and James Forrestal, the architect of that machinery, became, in his final agony, the proof of its terrible power. The Watcher had become the Watched. And in becoming the Watched, he revealed something dark about the entire world of watching that he had done so much to create. But the story of James Forrestal does not end with his death and the mysteries surrounding it. For the most important part of his legacy is not the manner of his passing, but the magnitude of what he left behind. James Forrestal died, but the machinery he built did not die with him. The institutions he helped to create, the apparatus of the national security state that he was so instrumental in constructing, did not vanish with their architect. They endured, they grew, they expanded, decade after decade, into something vaster and more powerful than even Forrestal could have imagined. The colossal structure of American military and intelligence power that dominates the world to this day. The Department of Defense that he first led has become the largest and most powerful military establishment in the history of the world, commanding budgets of staggering size, projecting force across the entire globe, an institution of almost unimaginable scale and reach. The intelligence agency whose creation he helped to bring about has become a vast and shadowy empire of espionage and covert action, its operations spanning the planet, its secret hand reaching into the affairs of nations everywhere. The whole apparatus of national security that he helped to build has grown into a permanent and dominant feature of American government and American life. Consider what that means, the sheer scale of the legacy that James Forrestal left behind. The institutions he helped to create in those few crucial years after the Second World War have shaped the entire course of modern history. They have fought wars and toppled governments, conducted surveillance on a massive scale, gathered the secrets of the world, projected American power into every corner of the globe. They have consumed trillions of dollars, employed millions of people, touched the lives of virtually everyone on the planet. They have become, in many ways, a state within the state, a permanent apparatus of power that persists regardless of which party holds office, which president sits in the White House, which way the political winds are blowing. They are the machinery of American superpower, the institutional foundation of American global dominance, and they trace their origins, in significant part, to the work of James Forrestal, the unelected financier who helped to design and build them at the dawn of the Cold War. And this brings us to the deepest meaning of the story of James Forrestal, the reason his life belongs in the company of all the others we have explored, the figures who shaped history from the shadows without ever facing the judgment of the voters. For James Forrestal was never elected to anything. He never ran for office, never submitted himself to the people, never won a single vote. He was a financier, a creature of Wall Street, lifted into power by appointment and connection, and from that unelected position he helped to construct the permanent machinery of American national security, the vast apparatus of military and intelligence power that would govern the nation's role in the world for generations. The institutions he built were not the creation of democratic deliberation, were not designed in the open by elected representatives accountable to the people. They were forged in the corridors of power by men like Forrestal, appointed officials and trusted insiders, and they were designed in significant part to operate in secret, beyond the reach of public scrutiny, beyond the ordinary mechanisms of democratic accountability. This was a development that would have alarmed the founders of the American Republic to the depths of their being, for it represented a profound departure from the principles on which the nation had been built. The men who founded the United States were deeply suspicious of concentrated power, of standing armies, of permanent and entrenched institutions of state that might escape the control of the people and threaten the liberties that the Republic existed to protect. They had designed a system of checks and balances precisely to prevent the accumulation of unaccountable power, to ensure that those who governed remained answerable to the governed, to guard against the emergence of any institution or any individual that might exercise authority beyond the reach of democratic control. The whole architecture of the American system was built on the premise that power must be checked, divided, scrutinized, held accountable, lest it grow into a threat to the freedom it was meant to serve. And the secret state that James Forrestal helped to build sat in profound tension with these founding principles. It was, by its very nature, designed to operate beyond the full reach of democratic accountability, to conduct its most sensitive activities in secret, to keep the public and even much of the elected government in the dark about what it was doing. It accumulated, over the decades, a power and an autonomy that the founders had labored to prevent. The power to wage secret wars, to conduct surveillance on a massive scale, to gather and act upon information hidden from public view, to shape the destiny of the nation and the world through channels that the ordinary citizen could neither see nor influence. This is the central and enduring tension at the heart of the national security state, the conflict between the demands of security in a dangerous world and the principles of openness and accountability on which a free republic depends. And it is a tension that has never been resolved. James Forrestal and the other architects of the secret state believed they were building the instruments necessary to protect the nation, and the dangers they confronted were real. But they were also building something that would accumulate vast, unaccountable power, something that would grow and endure and operate in the shadows long after they were gone. And the question of whether a free people can maintain such an apparatus without sacrificing the very freedoms it is meant to protect is a question that haunts the American experiment to this day, and that the story of James Forrestal poses with peculiar and tragic force. This is the enduring significance of James Forrestal and the enduring warning embedded in his story. He was a builder of unaccountable power, a creator of permanent institutions that would wield enormous influence over the lives of billions of people while operating to a significant degree in the shadows. The national security state that he helped to construct has accumulated over the decades a power and an autonomy that would have astonished the founders of the American Republic, a power to wage secret wars and conduct mass surveillance and shape the destiny of nations, often with minimal public knowledge and limited democratic control. And the man who did so much to build it was himself an unelected figure, a financier turned official, who designed the machinery of secret power, and then, in a final and terrible irony, was consumed by the very world of secrecy and suspicion that machinery embodied. The architect was destroyed by his architecture. The builder was buried beneath the weight of what he had built. So when we remember James Forrestal, or rather, when we fail to remember him, when his name fades from public memory while the institutions he created grow ever more powerful, we are confronting one of the central dramas of the modern age. The great machinery of national security power, the apparatus of military might and secret intelligence that shapes our world, was built by men whose names most people have never heard, unelected figures who designed in the shadows the structures that would govern everyone else. James Forrestal was one of the most important of them, a principal architect of the secret state, and his story, with all its triumph and all its tragedy, all its accomplishment and all its terrible irony, is the story of how that machinery came to be and of the price that one of its builders paid. He gave everything to construct the apparatus of American power, and that apparatus consumed him, body and mind, leaving behind a permanent and dominant institution and a forgotten and haunted man. The machinery James Forrestal built is still here, all around us, more powerful now than it has ever been, shaping the affairs of the world from behind a veil of secrecy and classification, exercising a power that few can see and fewer can check. And its architect lies largely forgotten. A name from the history books, a tragic figure whose terrible end became a mystery and whose monumental achievement became so vast and so permanent that we have ceased even to notice it, taking for granted the colossal national security state as though it had always existed, as though it were a fact of nature rather than the deliberate creation of men. But it was created, in those crucial years after the war, by James Forrestal and others like him, unelected builders of unaccountable power. And the world we live in now, the world of permanent military establishment and global surveillance and secret intelligence operations, is in large part their world, the world they made and left behind. James Forrestal is gone, lost to the darkness that consumed him, his death forever shrouded in the questions it provoked. But the secret state he built endures, and grows, and watches, and the questions his story raises, the questions about secret power and unaccountable institutions, and the price of the machinery we have built to keep ourselves safe, are questions that have never been more urgent and that we have scarcely begun to answer. The watcher became the watched, and then the watcher passed into history. But the watching never stopped, and it goes on, all around us, to this very day.